The first thing Sergeant Yemi Ademi did when the Vorath signal inverted was laugh. Not the laugh of someone who finds something funny, the laugh of someone who has watched too many low-budget action films about time inversion and recognizes the absurdity of living inside one. It was a short, airless sound, more wheeze than mirth, and it escaped her before she could stop it. The two Vorath analysts in the observation deck above her paused their calculations. One of them, she had started thinking of it as the confused one, because it always looked confused, tilted its elongated head, and chirped something to its companion. She did not speak Vorath. She did not need to. It was asking the same question it always asked when she did something inexplicable. That question, as far as she could tell from 3 months of captivity, was roughly, why does it keep doing that? Yemi tucked the laugh back inside her chest, where it belonged, and returned to studying the signal board. The board was not hers. Nothing in this room was hers. She was here because the Vorath had, in their methodical and alien fashion, concluded that a human who had been present during the Vorath's initial incursion on the Cascades installation might contain useful biological data about human reaction time under temporal inversion. They were correct. They had no idea how correct they were. The signal they were studying was a Vorath long-range coordination pulse, a system they used to synchronize their occupation fleets across 4 star systems simultaneously. It ran on something the Vorath called entropy threading, which, when Yemi had asked the confused one to explain it, through the translation interface, using small words, had produced a 7-minute monologue that she'd summarized internally as, "The signal goes backwards in time just enough to arrive before it was sent." Which should be impossible. Which was, in fact, also the entire premise of the Saul Kuhlman cinematic universe, a fact she chose not to share. She had been 15 when she watched Like Tenet on her uncle's cracked tablet in Lagos, back when streaming piracy was still easier than the alternative. She had watched all the sequels. She had watched The Teneting twice. She had, in the shameful privacy of her own memory, found it more comprehensible than the actual Nalen original. She was now 31, a sergeant in what remained of the 7th Combined Response Group, and she was sitting in an alien observation deck, studying a temporal signal system that worked exactly like the one in Like Tenet 5. The Teneting, which had been a 40-minute YouTube film with a budget of what appeared to be several $100s, and a commitment that more than compensated. The Vorath had never seen it. That was their mistake. The occupation had begun 16 months ago, though begun was doing considerable work in that sentence. The Vorath did not invade the way human strategists had spent centuries preparing for. There had been no approach trajectory, no detected fleet. They simply arrived, already positioned, their ships sitting in orbit like they'd always been there, their coordination signal already woven through every satellite, every relay station, every communication infrastructure humanity had built with such painstaking care over the preceding century. It had taken 6 minutes for every military command channel on Earth to go dark. The subsequent 3 months had looked, from the outside, like a defeat. From the inside, it had been a crash course in Vorath logistics. Yemi had been at the Cascades installation, not because she was exceptional, but because she was present, which is also why she survived when the others did not. She had been in the server room running a diagnostic on a tertiary relay when the Vorath arrived. She had watched through a ventilation grill as something that looked like a praying mantis made of oil and chrome walked through the installation's primary comms bay and inserted a device the size of a playing card into the main junction. The signal had changed immediately. She'd felt it in her fillings. She'd also had the presence of mind to photograph everything on the battered secondary phone she kept zipped in her breast pocket, the one that ran on a closed local network and had never, not once, touched the main grid. The Vorath found her 3 hours later, hidden behind a coolant manifold. They'd seemed almost irritated that she was alive. They'd cataloged her, processed her, and 3 weeks later, apparently deciding that a human who had photographed their signal relay from 3 meters distance deserved closer study. They'd given her access to the observation deck. Yemi had spent the first 2 weeks pretending to understand nothing. She understood quite a lot. The core of the Vorath occupation strategy was elegance. She had to give them that. The long-range coordination pulse was not a weapon, it was a key. It kept every Vorath asset synchronized across their deployment: ships, ground units, signal disruptors, atmospheric processors, through a temporal loopback that made it essentially unjammable by conventional means. You couldn't block a signal that arrived before it was sent. You couldn't interrupt a transmission that existed slightly outside the moment you were trying to interrupt it in. What you could do, and this was the part the Vorath had not considered, possibly because they had not grown up watching low-budget YouTube cinema, was invert it again. If a signal arrived before it was sent, then the moment it arrived, it had already been received. The arrival was the creation. The creation was the arrival. The signal was, in other words, a palindrome. And if you knew what a palindrome was, you could read it from either end. The confused one had given her a stylus and a tablet 2 weeks into her observation deck residency. She'd used it to demonstrate signal analysis, which impressed them. She'd also used it to write notes to herself in Yoruba, scattered among the analysis, which they could not read. The notes were detailed. They described every component of the signal architecture she had been able to observe. They described the relay device she had photographed, its dimensions, its apparent connection points, its single external interface port that she was fairly certain accepted standard optical cable, because the Vorath's equivalent of a technician had used something that looked functionally identical during the one maintenance visit she had witnessed. And in the margin of the 3rd page, in letters small enough to be mistaken for a calculation error, she had written, "This is exactly like the bit in like Tenet 5 where the main character breaks the loop by feeding the inverted signal its own timestamp, but with presumably lower production values." She had found the note weeks later and laughed again. The plan she eventually built was not elegant. Elegant plans require resources. Yemi had 1 phone, 1 stylus, 1 tablet not connected to anything, 3 months of careful observation, and the contents of her own memory. She had memorized the signal cadence, the precise rhythm of the coordination pulse as it cycled through its temporal loop. She had mapped the intervals between each inversion window, the brief moments when the pulse was in the process of becoming itself, when it existed in 2 temporal states simultaneously and was, for that fractional second, addressable. She had also, very quietly over the course of 11 weeks, been disassembling parts of the observation deck's secondary interface panel. The confused one had noticed once, and she had explained, with the translation interface, that she was investigating an anomalous vibration in the panel housing. The confused one had accepted this. The Vorath were not incurious. They simply lacked the particular human habit of suspecting that something small and seemingly helpless was doing something important. The component she needed was a signal reflector. She had made one from 3 circuit elements, a stretch of wire pulled from beneath the panel housing, and the battery from her secondary phone, which she could now no longer use as a phone but had not been using as a phone anyway since there was no one to call. The reflector was smaller than her fist. It looked like something a restless child had built in a waiting room from whatever loose pieces were available. It would not have impressed anyone at DARPA. It would have fit comfortably in the pocket of any character from the Saul Kuhlman cinematic universe. She had tested it twice, briefly, with no observable effect, which meant it had not triggered any alerts. That was the test. Effect was for later. Later turned out to be a Wednesday. She was fairly sure it was a Wednesday. She had been counting days by sleep cycles, which was imprecise, but she had started on a Wednesday. The confused one was in the observation deck at 3:40 local when Yemi picked up the reflector and walked to the signal interface. She didn't sprint. She didn't crouch. She walked the way she had walked every day for months, like someone who had been given access and expected to use it, like someone who belonged there. The confused one looked at her. She nodded at it, the way she'd nodded at it every morning for 4 months. The confused one, after a moment, went back to its calculations. The signal interface was a panel flush with the deck's exterior wall. She had watched it cycle exactly 847 times. She knew when the window was. She pressed the reflector to the interface port and waited. The pulse cycled. The inversion window opened. It was, in real time, approximately 0.4 seconds wide, barely long enough to register as a hesitation. She pushed the reflector in. The signal found its own timestamp. A signal moving backwards through time, given a mirror, will do what any moving thing does when it hits a mirror. It reverses. A signal already moving backwards will reverse to moving forward. A signal that is simultaneously its own cause and its own effect, given its own reflection, will, for one clean moment, try to be both at once. It could not be both at once. The coordination pulse collapsed. Not dramatically, not with an explosion or a visible effect or anything that could have been scored by the composer of the original tenet. It simply stopped. The signal board went dark. In orbit and across 4 star systems, every Vorath asset that had been synchronized through the pulse found itself, for the first time in 16 months, operating without coordination. 16 months of perfectly synchronized occupation, fractured into several thousand individual decision-making units, each carrying slightly different information, none of which matched. The confused one made a sound she had never heard before, a high, sustained note that might have been alarm. Yemi put the reflector in her pocket. "It's a palindrome," she told the confused one, through the translation interface, even though there was no particular reason to say it out loud. "You can read it from either end." The confused one stared at her. "It's from a movie," she added. What followed was not the clean victory that a better-funded story would have given her. The Vorath ground units did not immediately stand down. The ships in orbit did not fall from the sky. She spent 4 days in a holding cell while the Vorath attempted to diagnose what had happened to their signal architecture, which she found she could endure because she had spent 4 months in an observation deck, and the cell at least had better lighting. On the 5th day, the 7th Combined Response Group, which had spent the previous 16 months waiting for exactly this kind of window, began their operation. Yemi heard it before she saw it, the distant percussion of coordinated assault on discoordinated defenders, the sound of forces that had spent a year and a half learning to fight quietly suddenly being given permission to be loud. The holding cell door was opened on the 9th day by a corporal named Petrov, who was 22 and had a bruise covering most of the left side of his face, and was the best thing she had seen since before the occupation. "Sergeant Adami," he said. "Yes," she said. "They told me to find the person who killed the signal." He looked at her, she looked at him. "I expected. Someone taller. Someone with more equipment." She showed him the reflector. He turned it over in his hands with the expression of someone who had just been told that the thing responsible for ending a 16-month planetary occupation was roughly the size of a deck of cards and had been built in a room that technically belonged to the enemy. "It looks like something from a YouTube video," he said. "That," said Yemi, "is the highest possible compliment." She wrote the after-action report herself, because the officer who would normally have written it had not survived the first 3 months, and the next officer in line had not survived month 7, and the army of an occupied planet is necessarily a different organization than the army that existed before the occupation. She wrote it clearly, without jargon, with specific technical detail about the signal architecture and the inversion window, and the properties of a temporal palindrome when given its own reflection. She included diagrams. She also included in the appendix a citation for like Tenet 5, the teneting Dyer. Saul Kuhlman, 2023, approx. 40 minutes, available on YouTube. She described it as conceptually relevant source material and a surprisingly rigorous treatment of entropy threading dynamics given the budgetary constraints. She noted that the film's central conceit, that a backwards-moving signal, given its own timestamp as a mirror, would reverse and cancel itself, had not been, as far as she was aware, derived from any actual physics literature, but had proven correct in field conditions against a type IV temporal occupation grid. The report was classified, the appendix was not. The citation became, in certain circles, briefly famous. There were papers written. There were conferences. Someone at a major research institution submitted a funding application to study cinematically derived temporal signal theory, and in the chaos of post-occupation reconstruction, it was approved. Saul Kuhlman, reached for comment by a journalist covering the story 18 months later, said, I was just trying to make the sequel make sense. The Vorath filed their own after-action report, though Yemi would not learn this until much later, when translation archives became available and someone had the time to go through them. The relevant section read, in translation, the asset designated H7 demonstrated an anomalous capacity for pattern recognition under low-resource conditions. Asset utilized a temporal signal reflector constructed from salvaged components. Reflector design is not consistent with any cataloged human technology. Asset, when asked to explain the conceptual basis for the device, referenced a creative work. The creative work, upon analysis, contains an accurate functional description of entropy inversion collapse, embedded in a comedic narrative framework. This office has no explanation for why a species that correctly models entropy threading in its popular entertainment did not deploy this knowledge immediately. Recommend continued study. The recommendation was never acted on. The Vorath, it turned out, had plenty of other problems. On a quiet night about 2 years after the occupation ended, Yemi sat on the roof of a building in Abuja that had been rebuilt 3 times in 5 years and watched the first unclouded sky she had seen in longer than she wanted to count. The stars were clean and numerous. Some of them had, until recently, had Vorath assets parked in front of them. They looked better without. She had in her pocket her secondary phone. She had reloaded the battery from a proper power source. It worked again mostly. She opened it and found, still cached in local storage because she had never had a reason to delete it, a downloaded copy of like Tenet 5. The Teneting. She pressed play. The film began with a long shot of a man standing in a corridor, looking confused. A second man walked up to him and attempted to explain, in approximately 4 minutes of dense and self-contradicting dialogue, how time inversion worked. The first man nodded with the expression of someone who understood nothing and had decided not to let this stop him. He walked forward. The film committed, entirely and without embarrassment, to its own logic. Yemi watched it to the end. The ending was the beginning. She had always found that the most realistic part.